and to recognize in general that the alternative is often the weakest point of the debate. And many teams that are AF have started using uniqueness arguments, link uniqueness arguments as defense in order to make link debate, the part of the link debate or part of the impact debate, a lot more difficult to go for on its own. And while many teams in the past, used to be quite bad at things like the framework debate, and indeed, some still are, especially at Nuance, right? Multiple decades worth of negative framework debates, as well as having to justify their same fairness arguments and same like policymaking good arguments over and over again, have made it so that the alternative have made it so that like there's a lot of pushback, oftentimes just like tons of like stuff that you have to deal with on the framework debate that makes it more difficult to execute that strategy on its own. So this lecture is kind of a response to the phenomena I'm seeing, where alternatives are either have a lot of offense on them and kicked, or there's so little time spent on them by the AF, but the result is that the neg still doesn't really do anything with them because there's not a lot of strategic thought put into what they do. So with that said, in the spirit of dunking on Margaret Thatcher, this lecture functions as kind of a broad perspective on how to like reintroduce strategic alternative debating into your repertoire. Now, obviously, there's a lot of different types of alternatives, and I can't really go through every single genre in this speech, but I'm trying to kind of create broad strokes of strategic things that I have personally run into, I have judged recently, in order to kind of correct a number of missteps and make it so that the alternative is something that is, more viable, more of a threat against particular teams, and then hopefully can make you win more debates. Now, a lot of the question of how alternatives differ do relate to things like framework. For example, an alternative that is actualized through the performance of music or poetry will relate very differently to a round versus one that is about like conjuring or invoking a movement, right? And then similarly, ones that are about like reject the 1AC as an academic text differs from maybe intramural arguments about refusal that are about particular acts of microaggressions or battle fatigue or things like that. All of these things I think are legitimate, obviously, and I'm not going to harp a lot on the different kind of framework differences between these, except in relation to how it relates to alt debating. But some of the questions that we ask in this lecture and some of the arguments that we talk about may be placed on the framework debate. The point is, before every debate, I think that you all should be mapping out possible offense that can be read against your alternative. You should be using the alternative to diagnose particular weaknesses in your link arguments, such as things like uniqueness, and that you should be identifying which parts of the AF the alternative can potentially resolve in order to provide some defense. So a bit of an outline for the lecture. These are kind of the broad things that we're going to be going through. This was kind of just like a checklist of some of the different problems that I've seen and some of the ways I've seen address it. And I tried to group them decently well. So we're going to be talking about kind of scaling debate. In other words, this is kind of how you engage with framework arguments and make the question of how the ballot relates, or the question of what you need to do in order to win that your alternative solves, match with a lot of your systemic or structural impact claims, as well as to develop threshold arguments such as value to life arguments, ethics arguments that can also be bolsters to your alternative. After that, we're going to talk about theory arguments and the potential ways in which you can be more offensive towards them, or that you should not be as afraid of them in certain contexts. After that, we'll talk about uniqueness arguments, some of the like collapse inevitable, or like some of the arguments that you can use to make either status quo solves arguments or try or die claims for the alt. After that, we'll talk about debating the alt versus the perm and like negative permutations, which will segue pretty well into picks. At the end, I'll kind of tell you all that you should try making either an alternative strategy sheet, which for me means like kind of those questions I asked at the top, right? What does the alternative need to solve? What does it need to ameliorate in terms of link problems? and what possible weaknesses does the alternative have against one of the two apps that we have on the Dropbox or in the Google Drive. So first, we're going to talk about scaling the alternative, like I said. What I'm saying here, all alternatives must be framed in relation to how they solve your offense and how they relate to the space of debate. Essentially means, a lot of this, it might be, kind of basic, but links need uniqueness, and how they generate it is often explained through things like framework arguments. For example, if you're going for Baudrillard and you're saying that debate is governed by a symbolic economy, then the way that the alternative needs to disrupt things or needs to engage in a particular form of resistance needs to be at the level of the symbolic and needs to do so in such a way that any sort of link arguments to the status quo can be either overcome or that you can generate a unique link to the affirmative. It's similarly in the case of the CAPK, the alternative needs to have at least a risk of solving for or decreasing the potential of things like capitalism or neoliberalism, to the extent that at least to the extent that including the AF via the perm is net harmful compared to the alt alone. So I'm someone who harps a lot on examples as a judge, and I think that they're incredibly important. You'll hear me say this a million times over camp, right? But they're only important insofar as they coalesce into a broader strategy that has particular principles, guidelines, as well as judge direction that forms a broader alternative. And what I mean by this, right, is that I have frequently, especially in recent years, seen a lot of example-based explanation of alternatives that resides solely at the level of example and doesn't really have any prayer of solving kind of the broader scale theory of power or impact level arguments that the K is trying to present. The example I'll provide is in a lot of debates about the legalism K or settler colonialism, all these arguments about state reformism being bad. I see a lot of alternatives about individual acts of resistance, such as de-arresting, mutual aid, things like this, right? Not calling the cops, all of these kind of singular acts, right? But they are very infrequently weaved together into a broader principle about what an alternative social system looks like, what an alternative kind of pragmatic strategy of resistance looks like. And it's oftentimes just very bizarre that the impact or kind of theory of power debate begins with a massive explanation of a repressive state apparatus that is, crushing dissent, incorporating resistance. But then the alternative is just these very, I'm not trying to say these things are unimportant, right? But they seem pithy, in comparison to the kind of scale of the claims that you're making about how bad that system is, right? So this is the same thing with just listing organizations or listing particular actions, right? There's very infrequently a roadmap of what the alternative is trying to do, even with materialist analysis of things like the CAPK that should have large programmatic explanations for how things like capitalism are overwhelmed. It's usually just well, we include the New African People's Party, we include the Red Room Collective in New York, and it's just a list. There's no delving into what those particular examples do, what they uniquely offer in relation to the critique as a whole, and there's no kind of diagnosis of what the commonalities are between different examples, how they relate to some of the kind of link arguments that are being made. They kind of just exist as just to cover ink on the page, right? What insight to each of these examples offer? If you're citing something like Red Bloom in New York, what offense does that avoid? Right? What kinds of things does that make it so that you're able to deal with that you would not otherwise have to deal with? Because if you don't have an answer to those questions, you are wasting your own time, ultimately. Is means that you are not as adequately using your block or using the 1 in C or 2 in R in an effective way. And it's just opening yourself to more avenues for affirmative offense. One of the ways that I want to, so there's a couple different things I want to talk about that are maybe frames through which you can start thinking about how to avoid some of these things. One of the broad categories I'll talk about is prefigurative politics. for people that haven't heard this term, it just generally refers to actions or modes of practice that through their unfolding generate a different relationship to the subject, a different epistemology or ontology, right? So mutual aid isn't just the like material helping out of others, but it's also opens up a different way of thinking about the world that breaks out of things like possessive individualism, the atomic conception of the subject, right? So prefigurative politics is a framework that you can kind of apply to your alternative that is about how it can scale, how individual examples that you articulate or modes of like practice, for example, like in the street, as like people tend to talk about in debate a lot, right? How these things can congeal towards a broader towards a broader form of resistance or a broader paradigm of what resistance needs to be. In a very similar way. So it's obviously, like I said, connects with arguments about subject construction. Things about subject construction, the role of debate, how ballots shape what we do here are incredibly important because they, like I was saying earlier with like the Baudrillard or semiotic economy example, right? If you can win that like your particular lens about like what needs to come first, be it like material planning, symbolic economies, discourse, right? If that comes first and is something that is generated through debate, it is a lot easier for you to be able to win a quote unquote unique link or be able to win that your alternative actually has like some risk of disruption, right? But that requires kind of winning these like they're sometimes literal root cause arguments, but sometimes they're just like arguments about how politics is mediated, right? So another example that I'll use for this, right? It doesn't necessarily like because this is not only about like prefigurative politics in terms of like street action and things like that, right? But it's also about if you're a team that reads like arguments about performance, right? And you're like, what is playing something like music necessarily do? In the context of a broader structure, right? Well, if you win that like that structure is maintained through the particular organization of norms of performance, norms of action, then it means a lot more than if it's just like the performance of that music as like this is us like saying like F you to the system or something like that, right? So the point is that each alternative needs to kind of be paired with a broader theoretical analysis about the realm in which one is resisting, and that that is increasingly something that is like a step that is being left out, and it's a reason why alts seem a lot like less helpful. And then similarly, right? Like maybe like more basic example is something like the security K, right? Like in rejecting like a lot of like teams go for this, right? That like rejecting one instance of securitization or one instance of like problematic rhetoric in the context of IR or representations or whatever doesn't really matter if your argument is that like there's already like a broad social construction or a broad material formation that engages in securitized or necropolitical violence, right? But there is but if you are winning that like debate's rhetorical culture spills up to the effectuation of things like policy or intramural violence, etc., then it matters a whole lot more. Similar for arguments about like interpersonal violence or intramural violence within like this space, if the argument becomes about how individual debaters comport themselves in relationship to things like libidinal desires, in relation to microaggressions or systems of comfortability, then that obviously bumps up against some of the framework arguments, right? But it also means that like once you frame like this space, like the intramural, the debate space, quote unquote, as the most important kind of starting point, it makes a lot of your arguments about like individual rejection in this round or like refusal as a mode of like care and or resilience and or survival strategies a lot more persuasive. I want to briefly talk about imagination alternatives, not like super long, but just because I think that they have not really been utilized as much. The one that I remember being like, the most popular, at least in my debate career, was like I don't even know how much it's read anymore, but like the Kochi and Ordan, imagine the suicide of humanity, or the extinction of humanity as a way of breaking down anthropocentric ethics, right? So these types of arguments operate a little bit differently, right? So whereas like a lot of like arguments about like prefigurative movements might at least like give the AF their plan, and a lot of like these work differently insofar as they're just like debate is solely about testing ideas, and there's a particular educational value even if like at the end of the quote unquote scenario planning the bomb is dropped. And I think that these arguments could be utilized a lot more in order to maybe make particular net benefits to education that otherwise would not really be talked about. Another example is like there is a recent book by I think it's C. Heike Schotten called Queer Terror, which has a large section about moralism and about like the need to kind of moralistically to refuse the moralistic imperative to save human civilization at the level of like discourse, because doing so actually mobilizes a much more antagonistic and totalistic critique from the perspective of queer and anti-settler politics. So I think that these are the types of arguments that I think would be a lot more interesting to kind of engage in. I did get a question here, which is, do you think there's a difference between the imagination you're talking about and things like Afrofuturism? I think that Afrofuturism can be an example of these types of imagination alternatives, right? I think that they can also fall into one of these other categories. I'm not trying to like create strict lines of one can only be one versus the other, right? But you can make an argument about Afrofuturism that's like imagining nuclear extinction is actually useful for the developments of like Black sociality or collective resistance, right? And then there's another type of argument which is like, not related to like extinction, but rather is like more about like, reading music or poetry or forms of other like narrative from an Afrofuturist perspective, right? Which might be more about like the generation of value and the refusal to play the game, to even imagine the scenario, right? So part of what I'm trying to do here is kind of break up like, what do some of these alts actually try to accomplish? At what level do they operate? What do they give the AF in terms of like, can they weigh the 1AC? Are they only allowed to weigh it at like the level of like material consequences, or is it more about their education, right? So I think that it can definitely, like, the answer to that question is yes and no, right? It can be different than some of these imagination alts about like imagining extinction, but it also can be very similar in terms of, I think that there are a lot of authors that have definitely imagined post-apocalyptic worlds in the context of Afrofuturism. So mastering these particular arguments, I think, also helps with a lot of ways of dealing with alternative indites that I see commonly utilized. For example, basic just inevitability claims about like the inevitability of the state or capitalism or other sorts of forms of ideological or material investments. I think that things like prefiguration are really good answers to those things, because it demonstrates not only that there like is something outside of that inevitability, like there are people who are outside the law or who imagine non-capitalist worlds, right? But it's also about like how those acts of imagination, those practices of refusal in the street or otherwise, create alternate worlds, which may or may not, like, depending on what theory you're using, like already exist or need to be created. The already exist part, I'm thinking a lot of lines of like things like Wahale or Winter, like it's the Sun Ra quote, it's after the end of the world, don't you know that yet? Which is also like dovetails some of the Afrofuturism discussion we were just having. Similarly with like crackdown arguments or backlash arguments, which I see a lot, I'm seeing like a way in which a lot of K teams are kind of solely responding to these with non-uniqueness claims, which are like obviously fine, but like I think that there is that when you have a broader kind of theoretical or mechanistic way of organizing your alternative, that it makes it so that these particular indicts are a lot easier for you to like kind of navigate your way through or weave your way through. So for example, if I were debating now and I were debating a crackdown argument, right, I would not just be talking about like how that argument is not unique or how like, you know, weaponizing it against people is like violent, which are like good arguments, right? But I would also be saying that like, no, like certain forms of organization, certain forms of principles allow for evading things like state surveillance. There are like surveillance practices that can be like quite literally like sometimes evade state crackdown. There's like prisoner support. There are different ways of self-defense, right? And these are the kind of things that you should be kind of linking together for establishing a principle that kind of explains why your alternative leads to those things and what is the relationship of the alt to the actual debate round. And then separately from this, I think it's related, which is why I put it in the same slide, is threshold arguments. So these are basically judge instruction. They're a way for you to, because like alternatives are very weird. And I think if you've all debated critical AFs, either against them or with them, you've probably seen a lot of these arguments about like how do you determine the metric of solvency, right? Because like policy debate has kind of like scrambled a lot of our brains into like thinking that it's like a 0 or a 1 into whether or not something solves, like an affirmative solves something, or like probabilistic conceptions of solvency. It only kind of makes sense at the level of like implementable policies or plans, right? So this is like, how do you create different thresholds by which you actually solve the alternative? This might be something as simple as just try or die arguments, right? That's a very simple threshold argument about like, system's so bad, gonna kill us all now, we've got to fight against it, right? But then there's also other ways of thinking about this too, right? So a lot of when I'm talking about like value to life or personal value, right? In the context of something like performance, right? It might be internally valuable or generate psychic value sometimes to perform in a certain way against norms, even if that does not mean that the system itself crumbles. These are also arguments like this dovetails well with arguments about survival strategies, right? And then secondly, right, like it might be worth it to just antagonize the structure, which kind of gets more into like this ethics stuff, right? So what I have in mind when I was writing this part is kind of like the most common one in debate is things like revolutionary suicide. But it's not just that. It also can just be like, we have an obligation to fight this system even if we fail, or we might be uncertain about what the alternative looks like, but we have to kind of jump into that uncertainty as a kind of ethic that embraces the unknown or whatever particular theoretical position you're articulating, right? These are the types of arguments that I'm trying to encourage you all to supplement your alternatives and your critiques with, because they make it a lot easier to judge. And these are kind of typically where a lot of decisions are actually made, because they're evaluative. They provide the judge with actual directions about whether or not the alternative is efficacious. And as a result, they make it way easier for you to evaluate claims, even if you think the affirmative is like winning some defense to the alt or some indicts. So one thing I want to talk about here is an argument that I tried to develop like kind of late in my career that related to this, which is essentially alternative reciprocity arguments. These arguments tend to be made on framework or just in response to a theory argument. And essentially what they are is a way of breaking down the various ways that like there is a very like unequal way that judges tend to understand policy AFs versus Ks. So the way I want to break this down is like if a critique, even if it's like trying to do like something like mobilize a movement, right? Typically judges like are willing to reduce the negatives alternative down to like the lowest common denominator of like, well, you're just in a room speaking about the need for a revolution and they materially pass a policy. But there's like a very large gap that is kind of not theorized in that whole process, which is like the fact that like this is not just like a fiat's not real claim, right? But it is just like most affirmatives, in order to access their fiated arguments and like their impact claims, have an implicit argument about like the need to develop skills, to become effective citizen subjects, to eventually lobby or pressure the government to do something that resembles what their plan is. And fiat kind of just truncates all of that into just like one moment of just like should, right? Does that kind of make sense to people? That's like why that, yeah. And there's not really anything reciprocal or equitable for the neg if you want to be able to explain why your alternative is world changing or why it matters, right? So this is an argument about like sort of about like what does negative fiat look like in the world of the alternative, right? So on the right here is an example of like one type of this type of argument that I've tried to articulate in the past. I'm gonna pull up what this chat says real quick. I'm glad that Kane likes this. Yeah, because like, it was always kind of in this like a kind of back and forth between the neg saying, well, fiat's not real, and then and then the app being like, but it's educational. And like the reason why it's educational that they think is because it has the capacity to eventually lead to the thing that like they've said is so good in the 1AC, right? So this is a potential way to imagine how do you export, globalize, make more universal a particular movement, a set of principles, or even just like an ethic, right? So this doesn't have to just be about like literal movements, right? It can also be about like if you say that like your music or your mode of narrative, right, engenders a different form of subjectivity, you should also get like a certain level of being able to universalize that and be able to weigh what your alternative looks like at a more maximal level against the affirmative, right? Because they are ultimately universalizing what their thing looks like. If we talk about the various barriers that exist between like the status quo and the imagined implementation of any of these apps that you'll end up debating this year, right? We're talking about like obviously like a deadlocked Congress where like they spent like 8 months like debating like one already bipartisan infrastructure bill, right? And there is really like no attempt for them to kind of fill in the gap. So if they're allowed to just like bypass the would to the should question of the resolution, then you should also be able to bypass a couple of like the interim steps between you speaking in a room and a revolution happening, or you speaking in a room and like the world being ended through like a different ethic, right? And how you want to do this will differ in relation to like what type of alternative you're reading. If you're reading an argument about like utopianism or imagination, it might be a little bit more one-to-one in terms of how you imagine the alternative coming to be versus the plan text, right? But this is just like kind of a theoretical tool that I want to provide you all that you should like write your own version of whenever you're developing an alternative. Does anyone want me to stay here to like read the one that I have written, or yeah, just for a second? Yeah, we can just take a quick pause, and if people have any questions, you can also send them. After this, this is like a good pivot to theory. So I'm going to talk to you about a debate I had at Kentucky where something like this was a controversy and how it pissed me off.
And I guess while folks are looking over that, the only thing I have to say to this is like, this is a thing that I didn't really think about, but makes a lot of sense, because it's always like, why do policy teams get such a large leeway in terms of the process and the assumptions that we make about implementation? And the wholly hypothetical conversation between two different positions in an academic setting.
Yeah, that was that exact kind of contradiction that was like making me bang my head against the wall, especially during my like last year when I was reading a lot of alts that were about movements or about like anarchist resistance and stuff. People mostly good on this now? Cool, I have one last question. I'm hoping so, DeMarvin. I'm hoping so. Okay. So yeah, this will segue into theory arguments. I'm going to tell you a story before I get into like the spiel of how I think you should deal with them. So It's Kentucky in my last year. We are debating against a hedge team. So we decide to read a logistics argument for like the second time that we've done so this year. In short, their AF defended trade as like their means of generating hegemony. Our argument was that free trade is a violent system, and that hegemony is also super violent, and that we should engage in acts of logistical sabotage through pinpointing particular strategic, choke points or inflection points within logistics, within supply chains, and like either steal shit, blow shit up, that kind of thing, right? We were saying that we were kind of affirming large scale like material resistance through things like no DAPL, other particular movements that were about disruption of global supply chains, right? And as part of the argument that we were making, I was making this claim, right, about like it's necessary to globalize resistance. It's necessary to have like a kind of reciprocal conception of negative fiat, right? And this team from Berkeley makes this argument about like private actor fiat. And I was like losing my mind because their essential claim was just like your argument relies upon the individual fiating of like particular actors, such as like small scale movements. That's unpredictable because you could just fiat like, Joe Schmo. Yeah, they still read this nonsense. It's the most irritating thing I've ever seen. And like I'm just like I'm like flabbergasted because I'm just like, how is this different from what you all do? There's also particular actors like that have to be movers in the government that you all implicitly fiat, and like we don't like we were not even like saying fiat. We were saying that like no, you should assume that like rejection leads to a broader ethic. Yeah, exactly. Like individual federal pages, like individual consultants to consult on legislation. The fact that I guess it was Trump back then. Trump has to sign the bill. Like all of this stuff was also private actor fiat, right? And they end up going for this in the 2AR, like 6 minutes after like 45 seconds in the 1AR. And we lost, which infuriated me. But that's why my first thing that I want to emphasize is offense is your best friend. Something that I tried to do in that debate, and one of the judges understood that I was doing, was that you should not ever allow them to create a separation between theory and content when you're going for the K. Every single time, like every single critique has a justification for why the alternative you're reading is good, educationally valuable in this space, and why the link arguments you're making are like both fair and necessary. Which means that all of these like pseudo arguments like vagueness, utopianism, private actor fiat are all just ways of limiting out those conversations. They can't just make that purely a question of fairness when you've said that the debate is something. Usually like in that context it was like a training ground for logistical subjectivity, but in like a broader sense, right, you think debate is educational for something, right? You can't bracket those two things out. And you should not be afraid, therefore, to impact turn these arguments, to say, no, utopianism is good. You get utopianism. Why don't we? Vagueness is good. You condense an entire, like, 200-page policy into a sentence. This is not reciprocal. This is a bad mode of policy analysis. This is useless in terms of our ability to compare, like, large-scale philosophical or social change to something like policy or legal reform, right? So like I would definitely try to like make sure that those connections are always explicit. And then also just like as a thing I've noticed, a lot of teams get scared. I think sometimes justifiably, because you might not have like your block that's like, here's why floating picks are good, or you might not have your explanation for why like, like obviously sometimes like these teams that do theory all the time can be like a little scary to engage with, but you just have to not get in your head and to just realize that like at the base level, they're attempting to say you can't have particular types of alternative arguments or you can't make particular types of your links. And usually both your alternative cards and your link cards will provide justifications at an educational level for why you do need to do those things. in order to solve any of your arguments. Getting a little heated here because I could not understand the two RFDs of the two judges who thought that they could be somehow bracketed out. But yeah, like try to always kind of push back on these things directly because it'll give you, because they're ultimately limiting your ability to go for certain arguments. But also, this kind of circles back to the point I was making initially, right? Which is make sure you have a clear idea going into the debate about how you want your alternative to function, right? Sometimes because of things like framework, that it might operate maybe on like 2 or 3 levels. Sometimes it might be like, we affirm materiality if they're winning the framework debate, but also like if we win like framework, then it's like just about discourse or subjectivity or something, right? That can be okay, right? But just kind of always have a map in your head about like which particular things your alternative does need to defend. That way you don't just pivot away at like the first sign of like theoretical resistance, right? Because a lot, like the most common way I see this happen is teams, and like maybe this is just because they're not reading a pick, right? But teams are just like, floating picks are bad, and they're like, we were never a floating pick, and it's like, oh, I thought the alternative kind of was set up to be a floating pick in the 1 and C. I guess that's just an option they don't have for the 2 and R anymore, right? So, be brave in terms of going against these arguments. They're usually bullshit. All of your framework answers, all of your just content of your critique is designed to impact turn these like weird limiting out attempts. So we're going to talk about uniqueness arguments a little bit. Yeah, so this is probably the ones that you make or hear the most. System's unsustainable. Capitalism is collapsing. We've got 10 years. We got 5 years. We got 3. We got -3. Whatever. Right. These are the arguments about like that can be very helpful to the alternative because they make it so that like the status quo is untenable in a way that the affirmative cannot solve. But I think that it's important to kind of break these into 2 categories, right? There are kind of uniqueness arguments that can be kind of gone for on their own to make the critique kind of more like a disad, right? And then there are uniqueness arguments that rather set up a try or die claim that mean you have to go for the alternative. And the 2 examples I use here, right? Cap collapse leads to communism, right? Is an argument that like if that's true, right, movements are coming now to resist capitalism. In that context, you're reading a disad, right? You're reading an argument that says the status quo has movements that are going to result in the transition. The link arguments demonstrate that those movements get stultified in some way, and then you don't necessarily need an alternative because the status quo provides one, right? And that could be fine, right? But that will be different than like cap collapse causes extinction. We need something like the alternative in order to manage the transition, in which case you have to go for the alt. So like I think both of these are legitimate, and whether or not you go for one versus the other will depend on the particular debate. But I just want to like kind of schematize these into 2 different categories for you so that you have maybe just like a slightly better strategic understanding of which kind of uniqueness claims gives you a different 2 and R to go for. Yeah, so I think that these also provide a little bit of a solvency mechanism, like a way of filling in for if your judges are skeptical of some of the arguments that we've been talking about a second ago, about like reciprocal alternative solvency or neg fiat or these kinds of questions, right? A lot of judges that are like, I think the alt is doing too much, or like, I think your framework arguments are unfair. You can oftentimes migrate some of your attempt to deal with this into these kinds of like status quo solves, movements coming now arguments, because judges usually will not reject these arguments. And you can use these kinds of unsustainability claims in order to pose kind of broader questions about the affirmative or win a lower threshold of linker impact offense. And then you should also, I want to answer this question. Let's see. Yeah. To take out things like transition wars. So yeah, that kind of, I think that runs parallel to a question like the question I was trying to talk about earlier about crackdown, right? So a lot of the time, uh, it in this context, right? I think this is like the second category, right? This is like a try or die argument, right? So I think that you should be talking a lot about both ethical kind of mandates that the alternative would be able to more effectively universalize, as well as organizational kind of backstops to these kinds of problems, right? So, in the context of things like transition wars, right, you need to be talking about how the root cause of a lot of these transition wars are in like the context of cap, right? Particular systems of competition that exist between individuals, the way in which the system plays particular populations against each other in order to foster further antagonism, right? And how, for example, like the universalization of like a communist ethic or the a broad scale, like a large, visible communist movement articulates modes of social exchange that can provide an alternative to those forms of militancy. But at the same time, you want to talk about organizational backstops, right? How do you develop a party that is not only like an ethical alternative that makes people not want to fight, right, but also is able to fight if it needs to, right? So that means that thinking about things like cadre formation. It might be useful if, like, I'm just still talking about CAP, but like it's the easiest example, right? But like thinking about things like communes, which oftentimes, like, you know, in a literal Venezuelan context, right, they exist sometimes as a eventual replacement of the state, or a way in which you can militate against particular forms of still ongoing capital accumulation in those places, right? So the answer will be different a little bit based on your theory. Anarchist modes of resistance will be different than communist ones, right? And like the undercommons will have a different way of dealing with these things than other things, right? But it's kind of, you want to think about it through as two registers, right? How do we, at an ideological or ethical level, prevent those things from happening? And then to the extent that they do, how do we minimize the damage to them? And then last thing I'll say here is, you know, it's not just about like your broad scale impacts of stability that these kinds of things rely on. You want to be thinking in like a broader context about like, what can you use instability or uniqueness arguments in order to undermine that the AF needs, right? So is there like a particular value that or like advantage of theirs that is then like impossible, right? So like if their AF is like, the easiest example is like if their AF is about economic growth, right? But also just like, how does it enable circumvention if the political becomes like, you know, goes to hell, and like as a result like breaks down, and there's like widespread like right populist backlash, like that probably means implementation looks very different, right? So you always just want to be thinking about the different ways that you can employ these on different parts of the flow. One of my favorite ones that I think I actually included in the AF file is there's this Spillers and Lewis evidence that's about how we should think about I read it against a lot of like trade or hedge AFs, right? And it's about how systems of like globalization are pushed by elites, which then simultaneously break down the capacity for those elites to manage like right-wing populist backlash, which means that backlash creates like a snake eating its own tail that inevitably collapses systems of globalization, and means that it's like try or die for forms of like undercommon or fugitive resistance to those modes of racial capitalist formation, because otherwise the kind of system of like individuation or competition will just continue producing backlash in the attempt to secure globalization. That's just like an example I would talk about. All right, and then we're going to talk about the perm real quick. So there's, when I say alongside, right, I for a while like literally conceptualized like there might be a way of doing the perm and the alt at the same time, but it doesn't only have to be literally that, right? The main thing here is I'm just trying to decompartmentalize these two sections of the debate, because I think that what like a lot of the like flow centricity, which is not bad, right? But like it's kind of, when we think about debate, right, we break these up into different sections of our pieces of paper. And as a result, we kind of like forget how they interrelate, and it ends up being just like, okay, I have ink on them, that's enough. So it's just like a quick, alternative extension, and then like a tiny bit of offense on the perm, or like a co-option argument, right? And I want to kind of encourage us to think instead in terms of like every reason why the permutation fails needs to be theorized in parallel with what the alternative does about it. Which means that, like, so for example, if you're going for pessimism, right, and your argument is about like unflinching paradigmatic analysis and how that produces a drive towards like total abolition as a pedagogy, right? Then what does introducing a flinch or contingency do to make that particular form of abolition as like the outcome of your method less powerful or less useful? How does the alternative approach the kind of disads that they try to provide to it? And how does the permutation make those disads worse, right? You always want to be just like thinking about just like the materiality of these things to a decent degree, of just like, the permutation in their world looks like, socialists like maybe having a seat at the table, but ultimately the policy getting watered down. The permutation in our world means like socialists force the exact version of the policy that like we want, right? That's obviously like a kind of contrived example, right? But that's kind of what I'm trying to say, right? That like ultimately you want to be framing the kind of outcome of, like, you want to be thinking about the alternative in terms of its outcome, in terms of these kinds of threshold arguments we were making earlier, right? Which means that this also matters in terms of, actually, I'll get to that argument in a second. But this also is how you can make arguments about the negative permutation, which are popular now, stronger, both at the level of why you get it and also why it's preferable to a permutation on its own. So in the context of the latter, right, like I was saying, how does the alternative respond to affirmative forms of offense in a way that the negative permutation is unable to do? And then also, when making these arguments about why the permutation is a negative argument, I think you should also be trying to explicitly warrant, because the typical version of this is like, we introduced this argument about communism, we got them to talk about why capitalism is bad, or like we introduced this conversation and now they're sort of talking about what we're talking about. And it's like fine, right? But like I think that it does a lot more to kind of trace specifically what particular concessions the affirmative makes, or what kind of particular redescriptions of the AF happen after the introduction of the K, in order to justify why like a negative permutation makes sense, or why like the permutation they've provided is something that you should have access to. And the last thing I'll talk about here is like, a lot of this I've been talking about in terms of like movement politics still, but like a lot of these claims about why it's important to think about the alternative at the level of outcome also applies to performance-based arguments. So in the context of things like, a lot of the time there is a discussion of like, the negative did this performance, the affirmative says permutation, and the negative then says like, you're stealing our performance. And that's fine, right? You can make arguments about why like these kinds of stealing arguments are not helpful, but it's you want to it's not, you don't want to just be saying that it's like only unethical, that it's why you should reject them, right? But it's also that it's less efficacious. It doesn't access the types of performative solvency that were in the speech, right? What was it about the like literal doing in that 1NC or that particular whatever that accesses that the kind of net benefit to that performance that just like advocating for it rhetorically doesn't? Or what is it about one's subject position that makes it so that those particular performances matter more than the other team's subject position? Kind of last thing I'll say on the perm is that you always want to keep in mind, especially when making negative permutation arguments, the double bind question. Like the perm double bind is annoying and it's awful, but like it becomes more persuasive when there is not an effective calibration on the negatives part between the level of alt solvency that you're providing and the link that you're doing, which means that like thinking the alternative and the perm together allow you to kind of avoid making the alt too strong, that like the AF permutation overwhelms the links, or too weak such that the links can't overwhelm the status quo. Is there a chat? Oh yeah, absolutely, Rashad. So the negative permutation, I just kind of assumed that people were kind of familiar with. Yeah, the negative permutation it's very similar to a pick argument. It's basically an argument that like a particular gesture on the part of the negative is what inspired the affirmative to kind of move closer to them. So if like the negative reads like pessimism, right, and it's like unflinching and paradigmatic analysis, we should hold the state as adversary and want to destroy civil society, right? And then the affirmative, which previously had seemed just kind of like a toothless reform or like just like basic negative state action, suddenly is like, no, we collapse the state, right? Like it makes that clear rhetorical shift. Then the negative permutation is a way of saying like, hey, that permutation that you just offered about like the need for collapsing the state is like not really intrinsic to the affirmative at all, and in fact was just inspired by the fact that like we have articulated this particular ethical or alternative perspective. To the extent that like our arguments are combinable, you should assume that the alternative should come first, because the alternative is a more powerful version of their argument, and to whatever extent the AF is compatible in any way, you should presume neg in relation to those things. And that can look a couple different ways, but that's kind of like the best kind of generic, straightforward example I can talk about. That can be on the theory or framework debate. A lot of what I'm talking about here can be in either place, because most of it is not like most of what we've been talking about during this lecture is some of it's alt solvency, but most of it's alt framing, right? A lot of it is really about like how do you position how the alt should be like articulated or weighed in relation to other arguments on the flow, right? So you can put arguments about why like the permutation should be considered a negative argument, like on the framework debate. I'll read what Kane says here, right? If the AF attempts to include the alt or negative within an action that isn't intrinsic to the AF, the negative can quote unquote perm, right, in a certain way. And this is virtually indistinguishable from what a pick argument is or a floating pick argument. They operate very similarly. I think it's really just like there's no content level difference in terms of what you're advocating. It's really only like a slightly different theoretical perspective in terms of how it should be understood in relation to competition. So that kind of segues us to picks. Is it a floating pick, right? Is a question, right? So you should know going into the debate, I would say I've had way fewer debates that have been successful for me where I just sprung one on the other team that I hadn't really been theorizing a lot beforehand. So like to the extent that you want to make the pick like a sneak option, that's fine, but make sure that it's something that from the beginning you're like thinking about and having as an actual like laid out strategy that you're prepared to go for, right? So, and then the other thing you want to be thinking about, right? You always want to read the judge's philosophy about just like what they think about these things. You need to convey what you're picking out of and what is still included. How you conceivably can implement what part of the AF like post alts, like what do you solve? What is this actual terminal defense to? And then where did you actually like kind of hint that it was floating, right? That last part is important, because like a lot of the time it can be like a very clear question of perception. Judges that are more K-friendly will hear something with like a perked ear, like this does not necessarily preclude the affirmative plan, but, and realize like, oh, that's a floating pick. Like that's an attempt to kind of gesture at the idea that part of the AF can be included. But some judges want texts in relation to a floating pick, or at least a justification for why you don't need one. Some judges want an explicit, this can be a floating pick, right? Always be thinking about that. Another thing, going back to the theory question, right? If this is a strategy you're prepared to do, when they ask you in cross-ex, is it a floating pick? like, don't automatically say no, or don't be so wishy-washy that like it makes it so that the alt just like gets like a big question mark next to it on the judge's like, cross-sex flow or something. Always be like moving in these contexts and answering questions in a very deliberate way. And then this one's important, right? Always make sure the pick is like logically possible within your theory. Like if the K you're reading is like an abolition K and like says the state is irredeemable, then like there's only so many arguments that can reasonably be understood as a floating pick, especially on this topic, right? Which is very much about like government rules and regulations over the marketplace. Like there's not really like a bottom up way of doing that, right? Maybe it's like that it's a starting point question, and like certain like small scale movements can pressure the government to do certain things. But you always want to be very careful about how you're doing these, because picks also lend themselves, when not theorized correctly, to a lot of perm ground. Let's see. Jasmine says, if you want to go for the alt as a floating pick and they ask you in cross-ex, oh, someone's in the waiting room. Did we lose Eden? I'll make sure that everything's okay. I'm just gonna give a second for him to come back in. So how should you answer that question? Yeah. So there's so Jasmine, there's a couple different ways I think that you can answer that question, right? I think the easiest, like, there are some ways that you can kind of like quote unquote not answer the question while still like kind of getting at it. The easiest way I think is to kind of talk about what you think is available negative ground for that you are trying to pick out of. So if someone asks, so if I'm reading the security K, right, and like the eventual floating pick that I'm articulating is something like do the plan but without their advantages as justifications, or something, because like the rhetoric they're using is bad or something, and I think that discourse creates reality and that's all that's important. Then if they ask me, is this a floating pick, I would say something to the effect of like, well, our argument doesn't preclude things like policy action because it articulates that that things like discourse and justifications matter more in terms of what we value in debate, right? Some of that's kind of like a self-report, the way I just did. Obviously, like there's a little bit in which that that kind of does give the game up. So I would never try to be dishonest. I would always err towards maybe being a little bit transparent, and maybe they'll read their floating picks block against you, versus being so vague that both the judge doesn't know which way you answered the question, and it hurts your ability to explain what the alternative's focus is apart from the floating pick, like in a way that makes it more difficult for you to go for the alt. I'm always just like, it's debate. Make your arguments. It doesn't necessarily, you don't have to hide them so much. They're not gonna, in the like 2 minutes of prep they take between the 1NC and the 2AC, be able to like completely crush that strategy. And if they do, you should have like maybe another one as backup, right? Floating pick should always be kind of like never the only option, I would say. So like I said, right, if there is some like logical problems with how the floating pick works, such that there are certain contradictions between the ultimate the ultimate advocacy that is kind of gone for under the pick and the critique as a whole, it opens up ground for a permutation. So if you're like, pessimism, and you're like trying to just like, you're going for Afro-pessimism, you're reading it, your main link you're going for is like apocalyptic rhetoric is bad, but you're going for like the pick is like do the plan. If I'm AF, I'm going to be like, they said the entire world is irredeemably anti-Black and that like state reformism is a safety valve that is uniquely violent. That means that like, to the extent that they are allowed to like still include state reformism as a flinch, then we can also include apocalyptic rhetoric as a flinch or sever it, which means you can vote AF because they've contradicted themselves, right? So you want to avoid a 2AR being able to do that, which means you always just want to be careful about how you position these picks, right? Sometimes to resolve this incongruence, you can concede particular arguments in order to make your critique more targeted and leave behind certain certain arguments. So for example, that same example I was using, right? If I could theoretically concede in the 1AR, I'm going to concede that anti-blackness is a contingent phenomenon. I'll agree state reformism is possible, but they have not one defense to the claim that apocalyptic rhetoric is still a contingent form of anti-black violence. I'm going for that as my link argument, as a floating pick, because now it's still an anti-blackness argument, right? But it's no longer about like a maximally pessimist claim. And I can do that because I'm conceding their argument, right? But you have to be very careful when doing those things. And like, I would say practice with your coaches and like just theoretically map these things out. Try to imagine you were the other team and what possible, ways out they could articulate, right? And then that'll be a way of maybe strategically doing that. And last thing, right? Always make sure the pick argument matches the framework that you're going for, right? So if I am reading the security K and my pick is all of a sudden like a pick out of the state that is like, we should do things bottom up, right? That doesn't really make sense if my argument is like justifications and discourse come first, right? So you always want to be thinking about like, because the thing to remember, right? Your framework arguments about like what matters that you get to focus on, that you get to develop links to, is always your justification for why the pick is important, right? So as an example, the same example, right? If I am going for the security K and I say on the framework debate, justifications are the center of the debate, they matter more than plan focus because they determine why we do the plan rather than just reading the plan text in a vacuum, right? That's the same type of argument I'm making on the pick for why they should have to defend those justifications and why my ability to pick out of them is justifiable, right? And why it's something that is fair. So that's just the last thing there. And that is it. The assignment. Let me end the screen share. The assignment that I have for you all, and before we take questions and we just talk about whatever regarding alts, which can be literally whatever. It can be something I didn't even talk about. The assignment is take one of the two affirmatives. It might be easier to do the policy app, but if you want to deal with the logistics one, you can do that too. And create kind of a strategy sheet about what particular forms of alternative offense or just like how you need to position an alternative in relation to it, which means ask yourself questions like, okay, would I read this as a floating pick? Would my alternative operate at the level of just debate in terms of like refuse this scholarship, refuse this intramural performance? Would it imagine certain forms of spill out in terms of engaging in movements, right? Answer those questions. Think about potential routes of offense against your alternative and, maybe write a preliminary alternative overview that you would be comfortable reading against that app. And it might look different, right? Because it's a strategy sheet, right? Because, people will strategize in different ways. Jonathan, did you have a question?
Yeah, are we going to use evidence for this activity?
So I would say for this activity, you can do it. You don't need to paste in evidence, but you'll be referencing a desired 1NC you would want to read. That can be something that's like from the files that we've done here, but because this is not something that you're like reading and around against each other, it doesn't need to be limited only to the evidence set that we have here. So if you're like, I want to read like the Edelman K and like I want to kind of theorize, like this is an opportunity for you to kind of like think more deeply about the types of strategies you want to go for this year and how to like ask some of us like the consultants about how you think it needs to work in relationship to framework and the alt.
Awesome, thank you.
Is plan minus the link a good way to explain floating picks to avoid the perm? In general, yes, that's how you want to be thinking about them. In practice, how that works, given the examples I gave a second ago, can sometimes still be complicated, right? So that pessimism example I gave, right, where I go for apocalyptic rhetoric as the main link, right? Technically that is like link minus, right? But in the end, right, it still potentially contradicts itself because of the problems of including government action. So you always want to just be thinking about, like, are there other assumptions that my critique makes, or are there other links that I've made that are problematic? Absolutely, Eden. Glad to have you here, and good luck at work. So yeah, I think Kane said had a couple thoughts.
Yeah, overall, I think this was like a really good like lecture. As you know, I just mostly again was here as a participant, so like getting a chance to sort of hear you break down things that either like folks have done intuitively, or folks have like stopped doing as much, was really helpful and really useful. The other thing that your conversation, especially when you're talking about prefigurative politics.